And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Lianna Manibog, who's going to talk to us all about community and why we are where we are. Yeah?
Yeah.
Want to say anything else?
That's great.
Give it up.
So I want to thank Amanda and Bookish and King's English and Fisher for hosting all this. I think it's really cool that they're creating spaces like this for us to come together and have really important conversations and learn together. So thank you. And she said my name right, which was amazing. It intimidates a lot of people, but don't be fooled. It's very phonetic. All right. So my name is Lianna. I'm the founder of the Threadwork Collective. And tonight I'm going to be talking to all of you about community. So the title of this talk is meant to catch some attention, right? How we lost community and what comes next. And I want to just take a minute and thank all of you for being here. This is something that I believe is super important and I think can be traced back as one of the big roots for why we're facing a lot of what we're facing today. I think ultimately, I'm not teaching you necessarily anything new, so much as inviting you to remember something that is very deeply ingrained in all of us, which is this concept of community. And I think it is our work to uncover and remember what this means in its truest form. So, quick outline, what we're going to do tonight. First, we're going to talk about and define what community is. And then the part that also comes along with community quite often is this notion of belonging. What is that? And we're going to go into the crucial functions of community, where that distortion occurs, look at the intersection of community and power, and then come around back to where do we go from here. So this is going to be the start of an ongoing conversation. Obviously, it's a lot to cover, and we're going to kind of get the high level of things. But I hope this gives you somewhere to start from as you're looking at yourself, your relationship to each other, your relationship to your various circles of community that you're currently inhabiting. So it was really interesting. Before I started writing this talk and putting together the slides, I kind of did an informal poll and talked to people I knew and asked them for their definitions of community. And generally speaking, the definition of community was fairly the same. It's a group of people that we spend a lot of time with. Belonging is where it started to get a little bit more fuzzy, and it was described in very abstract terms. So I think that's something that I really want us to spend some time thinking about. And the way that I like to do these kinds of conversations is I'm up here talking, I have the microphone, but I do see this as a conversation. This is a flow, and I'm engaging with every single person in this room. And so to practice some of this and practice community, I would really like to invite you to take a moment, turn to somebody next to you, and I'm going to give you 5 minutes to engage. I really like to, from the angle of learning, turn on everybody's minds in the room and make this something that's really relatable and personal for you. So think about the last time you felt like you truly belonged. I think belonging is a felt sense experience, right? It's something we can feel in our bodies when we feel at home in a place versus when we're there and technically belong, but there's a disconnect. And I'd love for you to reflect on where were you? Who were you with? What made it feel safe or unsafe for you to be yourself? And again, this is all invitation. If this is something you're more comfortable doing kind of with yourself, feel free to do that. But if you are willing to, turn to somebody next to you, share some of these things with each other, introduce yourself. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to do that. I would love to hear the happy sound of you talking to each other, maybe making a new friend. Do you mind if I join you too?
Oh,
Okay.
I have a weekend full of stuff planned by myself. I was just saying that I feel like I belong because I'm here with my friends. So whenever I'm with my friends, I feel like I belong. If she would come by herself, yeah, still,
That's super cool.
yeah, I would. Yeah, I think going and things by myself makes me feel part of the community. Like tomorrow, I was just showing her at picnic There's a letter writing campaign, right, to representative. And I hope to go, but in a way, also.
Yeah.
And so it's about doing something as well, which is so fascinating to me because I hate showing up someplace by myself.
Yeah.
I feel so separate. I would never go to dinner by myself.
Oh, interesting.
That would be weird, but I can do pretty much everything. I would go to music by myself.
Yeah.
So that's a good example of community because we're all there to see the same bands. Yeah. And so you feel like you're with people that love the same music. So that's a different community. And then going to a protest I went to by myself, but I'm with people and I feel so maybe like performing in action. Coming here, I guess that. Yeah, so doing stuff solo, but there's a point to it.
Yeah.
About you.
So I like to say, I feel like studying community has been my whole life just because with my dad's job growing up, we moved a lot. Like in the third grade, I'll probably say this in a second. I was in 3 states and 3 schools in the third grade. It was a lot. So it just made me very conscious of like, how do I make new friends? How do I build a space where I feel like I belong when there's no continuity?
Yeah.
And that was happening during my very formative years. So it's something that like you realize the ways that people make you feel welcome versus the ways there's sometimes if you grew up in the same place, you're not aware of what that looks like because you're just in that ecosystem. And that's not bad.
So are you really comfortable showing up to places?
I didn't used to be. It used to scare the hell out of me when I was a kid. But yeah, now it's something that I feel like I've learned how to do. And like, there's something you can relate with everybody on. You just have to find what it is. And then it kind of becomes, in my mind, like a fun game of like, where can we connect, So yeah. What are your names? Trees and Paige. Okay. Yeah. Lianna. Nice to meet you both. Cool. Thank you for sharing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to go check on the time. All right, we got about 1 more minute, okay? 1 more minute, so start maybe wrapping up the conversations. All right, my friends, if we can start wrapping up, we'll jump right back in. Okay. I love this. I love this sound of friendships being formed. Okay, so I jumped down and joined one of the conversations, and it was really cool to hear different perspectives of community and what that looks like. One of my new friends was explaining that she would not ever feel comfortable showing up to somewhere on her own, and the other was saying she shows up to things on her own all the time. And ultimately in the conversation, kind of what it drilled down to was finding a sense of camaraderie and communion in the group that you are with. So for one, it is showing up with friends to something. For the other, it is a shared experience. So like a concert was given an example, right? But I think that shows this idea of community and how kind of nebulous the concept is, and that we get to shape what that looks like, and we get to decide who is our community. So I want to jump into the top question there. What is community? And I distilled that down. The way that I work with and have defined that at this point is it is simply a system of relationship. So it regulates belonging, safety, and meaning, and it is not inherently good or bad. It is a net neutral space, a net neutral entity, but it does shape behavior through interaction. And ultimately, it is something that is a core driver, a core need that we have as human beings that we seek. And it is something that we seek for if there's an absence. So why do we seek it? Why do we need community? First point is we aren't wired for individual survival. Even the really famous lone wolf trope has been proven to not be a very accurate picture. Ultimately, this idea of survival of the fittest and a warring of power where the strongest wins out, ultimately, if you zoom that far out enough, the species that survive are the species that have learned to collaborate and co-create. So this idea of power as relational, and that you can only prove that you have power in relation to defeating something else, doesn't really win out in the long term. And I think that's interesting if we start to plug that into this concept of narrative and ask ourselves, what stories are we buying into about community? What stories are we buying about the characters within the community? And who is making that meaning for us? Because I think, as was proven, community is a concept we get to shape. We get to decide what that means. And I think, which I'm going to get to a little bit further in this presentation, I think we lose and give away a lot of our power when we let other people define for us what community is. And I think that it is deeply ingrained. Epigenetics is a scientific field that, if I break it down to a really simple explanation, is just this idea that we have certain truths embedded in our DNA that we have learned, that are passed on through us generationally. This remembrance of community, this remembrance of the importance of our people around us, is deep within us. And I think it's something that's really important that we reconnect with, and that we remember that for our survival, we need to understand and take back our power to create what community means. There is safety in numbers. In our systems, there's a reason we joke about attachment styles, right? I'm anxious versus avoidant. But ultimately, abandonment meant death, right? There's a reason it's such a visceral sensation when we feel like we're being outcast or ostracized or abandoned. That ties back to that genetic evolutionary programming that we have within us. Community is also really crucial to identity formation. We learn what it means to be human through interactions with other human beings. It's a container for how we become human. And I think I'll go into that more on this next slide, but that is one of the main reasons it feels so devastating as well to lose community, is because when we lose our community, we start to ask the question, who even am I anymore? Anybody who's gone through a substantial shift in life can attest to that, whether you've questioned what your religion is, whether you've questioned your political affiliation, whether you've questioned your sexuality, anything that has resulted in some sort of ostracization or abandonment leaves you with this sense of being very, very unmoored. So, really quickly, identity forms through relationship, not isolation. It's from infancy. This is mirrored to us, or we learn this through mirroring. We watch our mother or father figures, right? And they reflect back to us ourselves. We learn how to speak. We pick up their syntax patterns. It's really interesting now in my mid-30s to even notice like little things that I picked up from my father and my grandfather, my mother and my grandmothers. Like, I used to think it was super nerdy that they loved crossword puzzles. Now I do all of them. I do them on New York Times. I do them on the news app. It's a little bit of a problem. We have an intervention. So through mirroring, through recognition, when you are seen, being seen And I want to differentiate between like the physical act of seeing and the other sense, the felt sense of being seen and recognized for who you are. Being seen and named as somebody, and being seen and named as somebody as a human being of merit and value in the way you show up in the world is really crucial to the way you understand yourself. If you think about that all the way back to, your early formative years, and I don't know how many of you have done therapy, but those moments when you have to work through having not felt seen or recognized. And then also by contrast. So even if you define yourself as I'm against this, you still are defining yourself in relation to another. So we need community in order to understand who we are and our place in that world. And I do think it's also important to state that identity is something that does continue to evolve in some sense over the course of our lifetime. So what does it mean to realize that identity is not a destination? To realize that identity is a process, and ultimately a lifelong process. Pillar 2 is community provides us simply just the raw materials for identity. The language that we use to describe our feelings, the roles that we're experiencing, the values, the way that we see the world. And I guess to take that even a level further, language really forms the way that we see the world. I remember reading a book back in college that was talking about the fact that if you talk to a sailor, they have a much more vast vocabulary to describe the ocean than your average layperson. So I can say there's a bay, there's a shore. That's pretty much it, actually, I think I have when it comes to oceans. Waves are great. But sailors have a complex, vast vocabulary. And if you have the language to name something, you then have the ability to see that in a different way than other people because you've added more context, right? It's like a painter using primary colors versus a painter who knows how to mix those colors and create a completely different picture because they have shades of nuance to add. So language very much shapes our world and the paradigm through which we experience the world. The norms, the things we're rewarded for, the things that are encouraged or discouraged, the things that are tolerated, the stories that we share. Ultimately, every single one of us understands our life through a particular narrative lens. And that's not making any value judgment on the truth or lack of truth in any narrative. But if you think about the story of your life, bringing you to sitting here in this room right now with me and all of our other friends in here, that you have a story that you tell yourself and that you have a role that you've assigned to yourself in that story. That extends out to your family, that extends out to your neighborhood, that extends out to any religious or spiritual community you're a part of, to the city, to the state, to the nation, and then globally as a human race, right? What stories did you learn? What stories have you chosen? And if you've never asked that question, I would encourage you to ask that because stories provide the framework that give meaning to every single part of our existence as we experience it. And when we reclaim or even claim for the first time our ability to choose the stories that we are inhabiting, that completely shifts everything. Roles as the last point on raw materials for identity feed right into that story point that I just discussed with you, right? What roles are you serving in your communities, in the spaces that you are living in? And ultimately, identity is less about truth and more about that point of survival. The questions that we find ourselves asking are, can I be myself and still belong? If I mess up, will I be exiled or will there be opportunity for repair? Is my difference a threat or is it a contribution? At a nervous system level, identity is tied to safety. I'm sure you can think of countless examples of how that plays out. All right, so let's talk about distorted community. Because I think ultimately we keep disparaging for good reason and having a lot of fears around what I'm calling distorted community, things like cults, things like gangs, closed systems, some of these really extreme online forums. But if we connect all the concepts that I've been talking about, we understand that community comes from a need to feel safe. Community comes from a need to be able to form identity. Community comes from a need to feel like we belong. Distorted community then is fulfilling a particular function, right? So instead of just criticizing people who end up in these communities, I think the better stance to take and the better move to do would be to ask the question, what are they finding in these communities that they can't find anywhere else? Because I think it's a really crucial point that's really easy to do. A lot of groups do this. If we see a community that we don't agree with, and there's good reason to have very strong feelings around certain communities, I understand that. But if we see a community we don't agree with, one of the first knee-jerk reactions, because of the fact that we form our understanding of identity in relation to other, is to push out and dehumanize. Is to act like we could never be that person or that group of people, right? But if we drill down to why we search for community, what have we created in the way that we have structured our communities to make it so the only place people are finding belonging are in spaces that offer safety through control or that offer belonging through fusion. And ultimately, through giving up identity, your sovereign individual identity, to these distorted communities that offer meaning through certainty. If you think about a lot of the ways that our leadership structures are run on all levels, who do we tend to pedestalize? We tend to pedestalize the loudest voices. We tend to collectively pedestalize the voices that promise that they have all the answers and they can fix all the problems, even in not necessarily extremely distorted communities per se, right? So there's something that's set there around the fear of uncertainty, which is a very human drive, and the attractive nature of certainty. But if the ways that we've structured our community platform the loudest voices that promise certainty, I would argue the people that we are bringing to positions of power, regardless of political affiliation, are not the people who should be in power. Okay? Thank you. Any human being or group that promises they have all the answers for you is not a healthy group. And I think the most fulfilled, the most whole humans, the most whole groups are able to be uncomfortable with the uncertainty, be able to be curious with each other, and be able to say, we don't know right now, but we can figure that out. Distorted community takes contribution, which is a facet of healthy community, because as human beings, we want to feel like we have purpose. That's again, another very human drive. We want to feel like we contribute meaning to the groups in which we inhabit. Distorted community shifts that to exploitation, where your dignity is removed and you simply become a means to an end. Distorted community takes boundaries and turns that into dehumanization. This is where I think we start to see a lot of divergence when we maybe disagree with people. And instead of approaching it from curiosity, the threat of something to what we think about the world and our experience and maybe our story that we're using to create meaning is too much to bear. So we have to push it aside and we have to dehumanize people who disagree with us. And then ritual, simply the things that we do to come together, whether that's shared meals, whether that's shared music, whether that's dance, right? Becomes compulsion, where more intensity means more truth. I would argue this is the very stripped back playbook for control. When healthy community disappears, human beings do not stop needing that. They attach to different substitutes. And if we want different outcomes, then we have to build different containers. We have to reclaim the containers that I do think we remember. And I think we have to start really thinking about ourselves, first and foremost, getting curious about our internal worlds, asking, when have I felt safe? When have I not felt safe? Who has made me feel like this? What did they do that made me feel like this? One really interesting definition that I got of belonging when I was doing my informal survey was from my sister. And she added a component that I hadn't heard anyone else give up to that point in my informal survey. But she said belonging is when you feel safe to be who you are, even if ultimately you're at a point in not really knowing who that is. And I think that's also really crucial, because if we go back to that concept of identity as a process and not a destination, as a lifelong pursuit, then this means, going back to this other point that we just hit on regarding certainty, that we have to allow people to change. We have to allow people to ask questions, and we have to not demonize them for doing so, right? And that means ourselves. We get to ask questions. We get to change our minds. That says nothing negative about us as human beings. Ultimately, people are going to defend community even when it hurts them, because of this being a core need for us as individuals, for us as living beings moving through this planet. Like we already talked about, unhealthy communities require sameness to maintain cohesion, whereas healthy communities build cohesion through relational trust and not uniformity. There's a difference between identity as belonging through conformity, where you have to strip back all of who you are and just simply accept the tenets put forward by a group, make yourself the same as everyone else to feel like you belong, and identity as belonging through contribution, a space where you're safe to ask questions, to be human, to make mistakes sometimes, but then know that there's a repair process where you aren't kicked out of the community indefinitely or forever because you made a mistake, because you had a moment. Once a community provides identity, belonging, and meaning, as well as regulation, leaving that community feels like death of self, it feels like nervous system collapse, and it feels like social exile. This is why people stay. This is why people stay in gangs. This is why people stay in cults. This is why people stay in abusive relationships, toxic family structures, toxic work environments. If this is such a deeply seated human need that stepping outside of your known community creates a feeling of death and loss of self, loss of your formed identity up to that point, can we create a sense of empathy? And can we create a space where people can feel safe enough to at least step in to start exploring what something else might look like for them with no other relational point necessarily? I think this is a crucial question for us to ask. Because if we cannot ask this question, if we cannot start creating spaces that invite this in, we really will never be able to create a coming together. So how can we extend that humanness? How can we extend the ability to recognize the humanness of another human being, another soul in front of us, regardless of what religious or spiritual construct you come from, and say, you have a place here. I don't really get you yet. You don't get me. But let's figure it out, I think it's healthy to have certain diagnostic questions to ask anytime you're entering into a new community space or even forming your own community, right? Because a community doesn't necessarily have to be a massive number of people. And I want to say, I kind of think of communities as like a bunch of Russian nesting dolls where you have, your family, your friends, and that extends out and out and out and out. But ultimately, they all interconnect. And all of it is connected. I like to think of the metaphor of like the human body. The human body is comprised of systems, which is comprised of organs, which is comprised of cells. I think it's very similar with community. I think it's very similar with other human beings. Right? They all better be connected. So I would encourage you to start asking these questions when you are creating community spaces or of the communities in which you're currently living. Does this increase people's agency or decrease it? Do we bond through love and creation or through shared enemies? Can someone disagree and remain belonging? Can someone leave with dignity? Are roles life-giving or are they extractive? Do rituals regulate or do they compel? Do we build bridges across difference or only tighten the in-group? And sometimes it's uncomfortable to ask these questions of certain communities that we're in because we might realize something's out of balance. And that's okay. Because first we have to recognize that something is out of balance if we ever hope to begin to change it. And ultimately, if we can't change that, hopefully you're to a place where you have people around you or other places that you can connect in so that you still feel like you have that sense of community. Because it is so deeply needed. It's so important. I think we underestimate the power of community. If we think about every single thing, every way that we experience various facets of our life, it was created through a community. The laws by which we live, created by community. This building in which we're sitting, created by community. The beverages that you're drinking, the food that you're eating, created by community. This, I think, again, is really rooted, and we did and have historically known this. It's embedded in our DNA. My family, my grandpa's from Hawaii. Everybody knows Ohana because of Lilo and Stitch. Ohana means family. But I really like to take that and say, it does mean family, but I want to expand that out more because it's one of those words that doesn't have a direct translation. It does mean family, but it's having a place that you always belong. It's having a place where you're always seen. It's having a place where you're always safe. But then conversely, it means that you have a responsibility to care for, to show up for, to offer those same things back to your ohana. This is the true sense of community. It is a reciprocal relationship where we are safe, where we are formed, where we discover who we are, where we make ourselves into human beings, and where we also find meaning because we are able to contribute and do the same for another. So, Audre Lorde said, without community, there is no liberation. But community must not mean a shedding of our differences, nor the pathetic pretense that these differences do not exist. A lot more to be said here. But I hope you sit with and think about these concepts. Connect with yourself. Connect with your communities. Ask these questions. Consider, how can I help create community spaces for other people to feel welcome and seen and cared for? And then I always like to end with some small things you can automatically leave with to do. Because I think it's great to talk about ideas. That's only as effective as what you do with those ideas, right? So small actions that invite relationality. Ask somebody a curious question with no agenda. Ask them simply because you want to know what their answer is. And then, I guess, point 4 down kind of goes part and parcel with that is practice true listening. If you're asking with actual curiosity, just listen and take in what they're saying. Let it affect you. Don't try and structure a response, right? Notice something specific and name it. Let yourself not know. I think if we start being much more comfortable expressing when we don't really know certain things, but then following that up with curiosity, be like, but maybe I'll go find out. Or like, let me ask some questions about that. It breaks down these constructs of what we think we need to show up as in different spaces. Because the secret is no one knows everything, you know? Follow interest, not just alignment, right? Like what draws you in? There's so many cool communities you could plug into. So what do you want to do? Not just because you feel like that's what you should want to do. And then end one interaction by naming connection. Express actual appreciation. Call it what it is. I don't really love the whole cool kid thing of like, oh, you want to be my friend too much, you know? Take it from me. I moved like my whole childhood. I was telling these ladies I talked to earlier, I was in the 3rd grade. I was in 3 different schools in 3 different states. Done it a lot. So I like to say I've been studying it my whole life. But yeah, it's a very human drive to want to connect. And I think it's a really beautiful thing to put out there that you're enjoying connecting with somebody. So lean into that. I think I'm getting about end of time here, but got some recommended readings for you. Kind of different chunks are how I put these books together because I'm a big reader. It's one of my favorite things to do. But first recommendation, Bell Hooks, book Belonging, A Culture of Place. It's a bunch of different essays where she's exploring how love and memory and accountability are inseparable for community. And that belonging is not a passive inclusion, but it's an active practice. And she roots this a lot into where she came from and her experiences in Kentucky and what that did for her formation of identity. So it's a little bit more meandering, so not story driven necessarily, but really beautiful, profound work. The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt is a moral philosopher. I used to teach English classes, and I would use this book quite often because he takes some time to explain why people with different moral frameworks talk past each other. And really does a lot to challenge our notions of why we believe what we believe when it comes to moral frameworks. Not arguing moral relativism, but just saying, hey, maybe challenge your assumptions. And I personally believe any question that we're afraid to ask is probably one of the questions we need to ask ourselves the most. Because anything that doesn't stand examination might be worth considering amending or replacing in some way. So that is The Righteous Mind. And we've got Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which classic, right? This is all about kinship and relationality, rooted in indigenous wisdoms and models. And then if you're wondering, how do I talk to people non-violently? Marshall Rosenberg does a great job of breaking that down. So he gives some practical language for that. Then I've got some more story and poetry driven pieces for you. So East of Eden by Steinbeck looks at how communities are shaped by cycles of harm and redemption, which I think is a really beautiful way to learn through story some of these concepts. And then 2 poetry collections. An American Sunrise by Joy Harjo. She roots community and ancestral memory, grief, survival, and talks about this with her own heritage. And then Mary Oliver really dives into attentiveness to nature, inner life, showing how shared meaning can create a really beautiful emotional groundwork. So then I added one bonus one because I just really needed to be symmetrical, and I only gave them 7. But I knew that they had emergent strategy from last time if you were here at Perspectives Over Pints. So yeah, really great framework for community building by Adrienne Marie Brown. So that's what I got for you. Please find communities. Build in your communities. If you're curious about the work I'm doing, you can find me at the threadworkcollective.org. And yeah, would love to chat with you. So that's what I got for you tonight.
Okay, you have 15 minutes to questions. So Lianna's going to take some questions for you. You can just politely shout at me if you could kindly yell non-violently. That would be the preferred method of communication. And yeah, speak loudly. Go ahead. What is the Threadwork Collective? What do you do?
Thank you for asking. I'll pay you later. So the Threadwork Collective is my nonprofit. I started it back in March. And the short story of it is I'm a local musician. I was asked to host a radio show. And I was like, why? There's already a lot. But then ultimately I was like, well, one angle that I think would be really cool is to find a way to use these platforms to talk more about community. And I think that ultimately we need a space where we're called to remember what community is and be taught some of the skills of living in community effectively. Because it is things like, how do we communicate nonviolently? Or how do we feel our emotions? And I say this because I've had to learn all of these things. How do I feel my emotions and acknowledge it in a way that's healthy and honoring what it's telling me without doing harm? And how do I allow for difference and ultimately still realize we can create something together? So this nonprofit is a space where I'm using music and story, where I'm using experiential spaces to create community for people to come together and see what actual healthy community can look like. Creating educational resources. I used to be an educator, so I love to put things together and help people learn and ask questions. And that's the whole purpose of this nonprofit. Thank you for asking. Yes.
Seems the most toxic, distorted communities have their doors wide open for new recruits, new people. How can we make sure our communities, our healthier communities, hopefully, have our doors as wide open to be more inviting to people who might not feel like they belong?
Yeah. Thank you for asking. Um, I have a thought on that, but this is something that I also think I would love and welcome other feedback on. I think it's an ongoing conversation, right? And I think it is creating spaces where people can enter in at different levels. I think it is saying, I think music can be a great way to do that. I think creating settings like this where people can come together and grab a drink, or block parties, or if you have a new neighbor, inviting them in. Ultimately, we aren't automatically going to know where people fall in an ideological spectrum just by looking at them necessarily, right? But I think hopefully if we're approaching this idea of humanity with recognizing and being able to be a little bit more aware of the fact that like we all want that and need that, how can we start inviting people in our own areas, in our own circles? Because ultimately, I think it always does come down to a grassroots approach. Where are your spheres of influence right now? We can probably all think of at least one person, if not a couple of people, who could probably use some community. How do we invite them in? And how do we start to have some of these conversations where we actually are having conversations? Productive discourse, you know? So I think there's a lot more to say about that, but I think starting with ourselves is key. And then if you would like to join me, come along, because this is what I want to do, what I am doing. Yeah.
I think a piece of this that goes along with your question, what you lightly touched on, is just the ability to be vulnerable with people. So you know, you can't invite someone into your community if you're not willing to show yourself. And you mentioned doing some therapeutic work and being willing to look at yourself. The more you can look at yourself, you can look at others and hold space for others. It's what you're doing. Holding space to talk and have open conversation.
Yeah.
It's scary.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry, I forgot the pageant format I was supposed to use in these questions, which I was supposed to repeat them back out loud. But what was just said is that vulnerability ultimately is one of the key ingredients to this whole thing. And that vulnerability is both outward facing and inward facing. The vulnerability to face ourselves and sometimes the things that we're really uncomfortable with and maybe not proud of. And also being willing to like extend that outwards and share that with others and receive their vulnerability, right? A lot to say about that, but I think We're all looking for a place where we can be witnessed. And I think that requires this reciprocal relationship of also being willing to witness. Ultimately, in a very simple way, that's one of the things I think therapy offers is the opportunity to be seen and to share your stories and to witness your stories being heard and received by somebody else. And I love therapy. I think it's amazing. I also think we can do that better in community. So thank you. Yeah.
Work on repairs. Counts.
Mhm.
Get out of it. For maybe being in a different place in their journey or coming from another background, how do you interpret?
Yeah, thank you. So the question was, how do we encourage repair in our communities? And I just did an interview with a colleague of mine. His name's Marona Benali, and he's super cool. He's done a lot of work taking the Navajo framework and cosmology and looking at what that looks like in application to our different systems of living. But one of the concepts that he talked about in our interview was this idea of shame, because I think shame ties into this. I think cancel culture ties into shame. It's this idea of somebody's behaving poorly, is making them feel shame for their poor behavior. And I think there are levels, right? I think there's a healthy degree of shame if we realize that we're not acting in integrity with who we want to be. I think there's toxic shame where then the shame becomes our identity. And I think these repair spaces, to go to one of Moroni's points in our interview, was he said the Navajo concept of shame is basically defined as not in right way. So if you follow that through, not in right way, in relation to this concept of kinship and relationality, that we're all connected, then with it requires, well, how do we bring that back into balance? How do we help this person to come back into right way with themselves, with each other, with community? And so I think transformational justice is a big thing that talks about this. And I don't have an easy answer because, yeah, if somebody offends you because they accidentally slam the door in your face, that's one thing. But the degrees of harm get bigger, right? And I can't give somebody an answer for what kind of recompense that they need for substantial harm. But I think we need to have these conversations. And I think we need to figure out what healthy boundaries look like and what our concepts of forgiveness look like. And I can tell you my thoughts on my experiences with that, but that's a longer conversation. But I do think we should be asking these questions because I do think ultimately we have to realize that we are still within this community with each other. So how do we hold responsible without ultimately pushing somebody fully out? And how do we cause space for repair and healing? Yeah. Thank you for asking. If you go just to my website there, I have all the information. I'm actually going to be launching in March a monthly newsletter that's going to have all the different events coming up. I do local community radio. Laura from Radioactive Carousel is here. We're doing live community radio shows as well to encourage conversation with community members. Would love to have you come through. So, I think, do we have time for one more or where are we at?
Do one more.
Okay.
Literally 1 minute.
Okay. One word answer is all I got for you, I guess.
No. I'll ask. I'm just curious about morals.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you experience or like lead with curiosity with somebody?
Yeah. I'm gonna need a few more than like one word if that's okay. Okay, thank you. Well, one, I think it's really important to acknowledge that like the emotions are valid, whether it's anger, whether it's grief, whatever you're feeling, that's super valid and should be honored. I think finding a channel for the emotion that is not destructive to the other person is really important. I also think knowing what your boundaries are is really, really crucial because if we understand the concept of boundaries as what I need to be safe, not boundaries as how can I control them. Then you know what you need to be safe. Then you can engage in conversations. Then you can know when you need to cut off a conversation. Then you can invite somebody in and not feel threatened at being overpowered. And then hopefully, I mean, it does require the other person to be to that space too, right? And we can't control that all the time. But ultimately, this being a very human need, ideally, I think we can't fight control with control. All we can do is invite. Invitation is the way forward. So how do we create spaces that make people curious enough that they want to start checking that out and questioning maybe what's going different over here than where I came from? Yeah. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I didn't have a punchline ready again. It was not. Shout out to Threadwork Collective for all that they do and for
Thank
Karen.
you.
I didn't realize you were here. Hi, Laura. Now, Karen is holding it down. Being solid Pally. We have one more of these. We're hoping that Fisher's going to let us come back for even more. So our next one is booked for Wednesday, March 11th. And the topic of conversation is You and I Are Earth. Ochre is our geokin. Okay, so our poems are. Her name's Apitha. She's the owner of Books and Supply. She comes from academia. Very nuanced. I can't wait. It sounds very extraterrestrial. I don't know. I don't even want to say anything else, and this is stupid. Okay, but otherwise, I remind us, thanks again for coming and being here. We have all of Lianna's picks up for sale in the front and some fun King's English merch if you're keen there. Otherwise, tip your bartenders as always, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Yeah. How'd you feel? How'd it do?
So fun. I love that. Yeah, that was
Good.
great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.